So, using the examples provided in the course exam description for AP Psychology, we're first going to look at the AAQ, or double AQ. So notice how it marks each part of the question with a letter, A through F. You need to answer all of these. It's not pick and choose. I have marked the easiest questions in red, where you can simply restate the question and then put in the answer based on the documents that you read. So identify and state, you could merely just say, one ethical guideline used was debriefing, informed consent. You could say, identify the research method. The research method was an experiment, or the research method was non-experimental as a case study. The ones marked in green are more in-depth, so it asks you to understand and describe the meaning of the differences in the means between the immediate recall task, dealing with memory, with the multivitamin group and the placebo group. So the experimental group versus the control group. What does it mean if one group has a higher mean than the other? What do those results indicate? So you do have to actually know those words like mean, median, and mode, and standard deviation in order to answer that question. So it's not just reading the documents and then providing an answer randomly. You do have to know how to interpret the results that you're looking at. Explain the extent to which the research findings are generalizable. In addition to explaining how generalizable they are, you have to explain to whom they are generalizable. So if you're saying this is generalizable to teenagers, okay, well, how do you know that it can be applied to teenagers as a whole? Well, you look at the group that they studied. Did they study teenagers? Or were they studying teenagers and 60-year-olds? Were they studying men and women? Are they only studying men? Okay, make sure that you explain why you make the claim that it can only be applied to a certain population or to a larger population. Explain how at least one of the findings supports or refutes the hypothesis. So if they hypothesize that taking a multivitamin slows cognitive decline, what proof do you have from the article, from the source, that supports or refutes this claim? Do they accept or do they reject the null hypothesis based on these results? So the source that they give us in the CED for this illustrative example is as follows. You do need to read the entire document, but as you go, I would recommend brainstorming and marking specific terms so that you don't have to go back and reread the article after that 10-minute period. So it looks like they are trying to test whether taking a multivitamin makes a difference in improving cognitive decline. So they are specifically looking at if a multivitamin slows cognitive decline or if it has no effect on that decline. So an earlier study in 2017 had a sample of 21,000 people. That's a large sample. Okay, so that is applicable. You don't want a sample size of only 10. That's not going to be very generalizable. So they examined the effects of taking a multivitamin on health. Now we are focusing in on a more specific operational definition of cognitive decline. From that study sample, over 7,000 received a mailed invitation. 4,000 agreed to participate. To participate, they had to be over 65 years of age. So here we have generalizability based on age if they were women. So here we have the gender aspect. And over 60 years of age if men. So they're studying both men and women. And if you look over at the chart that they provide of the demographics, you can see that the ages are fairly similar. Okay, group 1 versus group 2, the experimental group who received the independent variable versus the control group who received a placebo. The age differences aren't that big, 70.9 versus 71. You have approximately an equal percentage of men for both groups, as well as women for both groups. And as you continue down the line of how they break it down by race or ethnicity, again, you see similar numbers. Okay, so the experimental group and the control group, which hopefully are randomly assigned, were fairly similar in their makeup. That helps to decrease the risk of confounding variables. In addition, they could not participate if they ever had a stroke, received a cancer diagnosis in 2 years before the study, or had a history of any other serious illnesses. So again, trying to eliminate as much as possible any confounding variables that could skew the results of this study. A computer randomly assigned participants. Excellent. Okay, we want that random assignment. You should always make it random to help with decreasing any skewing of the data. Because they're studying at the effects of a multivitamin on cognitive decline, and they're going to be providing the independent variable of the multivitamin versus a placebo, we know that this is experimental. So there we have our answer to the first question. The research method used in the study is the experimental method. As we keep reading and brainstorming, participants in Group 1 received a pack of multivitamins each month by mail to take 1 pill twice a day, giving us our operational definitions. Our independent variable, the thing we manipulate, is whether or not they get a multivitamin, and they specifically list out how many they are supposed to take and how often. Participants in the control group received a pack of placebos. The sample size of Group 1 was about 17,000, and the sample size of Group 2 about 18,000. So trying to get those random assignments about as equivalent as possible. So if our independent variable is a multivitamin, then our dependent variable is going to be cognitive decline. But we need to be more specific in what that means. How do you define cognitive decline? Okay, so they're going to have to give us their operational definitions. If we keep reading the same source, once a year for 3 years, participants were asked to complete an online test. So how are they measuring it? To evaluate episodic memory and executive functioning. So we have 2 variables that they're studying. They are studying episodic memory, which you'll learn deals with episodes in your personal life, like who you took to prom, your first day of school, things like that, and executive functioning, how well you're able to function cognitively. So how do you problem solve? How do you effectively make decisions? Instructions on how to access the test were emailed. They responded, indicated their consent. So here we have our ethical guidelines. Informed consent. They also received a $15 gift card for each assessment, regardless of completion. So is there coercion? No. It's not like they need to complete this study in order to survive, and so like they're lower socioeconomic scale, and so they go into this medical experiment so that they can find a cure to like a disease. Okay, there's no pressure being put on them. Even if they don't complete the assessment, they still receive the $15 gift card. If it were $10,000 for participating, that might be a little bit more coercive. Okay, that could bias the results into like who's more likely to participate in an experiment where they're able to make that amount of money. Okay, so this is low stakes here, thus limiting the amount of coercion present. They also look at the harm, so potential harm. We want to reduce the long-term negative effects that could result from a study like this. So the side effects of taking the independent variable could be some stomach pain, so your tummy hurts, some diarrhea, right? Those are normal side effects. Taking this multivitamin is not going to increase your cognitive decline rapidly or cause you to die or cause you to have a stroke. So 2 different tasks were used to measure. This is where we get operational definitions. If you're studying the effects on episodic memory, how are you going to measure that? If you're studying the effects on executive functioning, how are you going to measure it? So for episodic memory, participants completed a recall task in which they were shown a set of words presented one at a time for 3 seconds each. They're then asked to recall the set of words once immediately after the word list and then again after 15 minutes. Patients who recalled more words correctly earned higher scores. So higher accuracy equals a higher score. With executive functioning, participants are shown a set of items and then shown a second set of items. They were asked to identify whether the items in the second set were the same or different from the first set. This is also based on accuracy. Participants earned higher scores the more quickly they correctly identified whether or not they were the same or different from the original set. So remember that our question asked for the operational definition of executive functioning. This is where they may try to trip you up. You may see, episodic memory. That starts with an E. I'm going to write that they had a recall test where they were showed a set of words. Well, that's not the correct answer. It's specifically asking you for the operational definition of executive functioning. So don't try to list every single operational definition in this document, because if you contradict yourself, then you lose the points that you might otherwise have gotten. You should only focus on how they define executive functioning. They measure it, they define it based on accuracy of a test, determining whether items are the same or different from an earlier set. You can write that in one sentence and then get your point. Then, moving on to results. Compared with the placebo, the experimental group receiving the multivitamin had significantly greater improvement in recall. So we do see causation here for memory. Performance on the immediate recall task in group 1 improved from an average, a mean of 7.1 words to 7.81 words, an improvement of 0.71. To make this easier for me, I just think of this like a percentage. It's not literally a percentage, but I deal better with whole numbers. In group 2, the placebo, the performance on the immediate recall task improved from a mean of 7.21 to 7.65, or an improvement mean of 44. So group 2, 44%. Is there a big difference between 71% and 44%? I would say so. If you got a test that had a 71 on it versus a test with a 44, you would say that that's quite a stark difference. Okay, that's like a C versus an F. Again, not a perfect metaphor because we're not dealing with percentages, but I'm just trying to show the rate of difference between those means. That difference is significant. What this shows is that multivitamin usage does indicate some sort of improvement in your recall ability. When it comes to the other variable they measured, researchers estimate that the effect of the multivitamin intervention improved memory performance by the equivalent of 3.1 years compared to participants in the placebo group. But researchers found that executive function, the thing that we operationally defined for our Part B of the questions, was not significantly impacted. So multivitamins do have an impact on recall, but not executive functioning. So, based off of the documents we just read, we are going to answer each of the 6 questions that the AAQ or AAQ provides us on the exam. So for the first one, identify the research method. B, state the operational definition. C, describe the meaning of the difference in the means. D, one ethical guideline. E, how generalizable is the study results. And F, explain how at least one of the findings supports or refutes the hypothesis about cognitive decline. So your answers should look something like this. Notice how they're all in complete sentences. So A, it asks for the research method. So we say the research method used in this study was an experiment. And that's it. We don't have to say if it was a case study or naturalistic observation. We simply say experiment. It has an independent variable and a dependent variable. You have the independent variable being manipulated, and then they're studying to see the effects that the multivitamin independent variable has on cognitive decline. B, the operational definition of executive functioning, not explicit memory, but executive functioning, is the scores on the test whether the participant correctly identified the second set of objects as the same or different more quickly. So it's based on accuracy of the specific test with the objects, not with the string of numbers where they paused and then had them see if they could recall them. Again, we're not looking for the definition for memory. We're looking at how they measure executive functioning. C, what does it mean that the means are different? Well, you had a difference from like 70 to 40. That's a pretty statistically significant difference. And so it shows that the multivitamin group that had a larger mean had better recall than the placebo group. So we see here a statistically significant difference, indicating that the multivitamin did have a cause and effect relationship on the dependent variable. D, researchers complied with ethical guidelines by obtaining informed consent from participants ahead of time. This is not the only example that you could use. Since this is a free response, there are multiple right answers that you could use, but you can't just make something up from an ethical guideline that you know about, but that's not present in the actual study. For instance, like if you just said they debriefed after the experiment to share their results, well, that wasn't noted in the document, so you can't make that claim. E, to whom is this generalizable? Well, you could answer that it's generalizable to both men and women, as both were tested in the study. You could say that it's not generalizable to teenagers because there were no teenagers in this study. It looked at people in their 60s and older. F, the results support the researcher's hypothesis. If you just say that it supports the hypothesis, that's 1 point. But if you actually explain what in the document supports their hypothesis or refutes their hypothesis, that's when you get the additional point. So the results support the hypothesis that older adults can delay some cognitive decline if they take a multivitamin because it seems to improve episodic memory, not executive function. So you could argue it supports the hypothesis about cognitive decline with regards to episodic memory. Or you could say the results refute the hypothesis in regards to executive functioning. But you do have to interpret it accurately. If you said that it supports it because it improves executive function, well, the results did not show a statistically significant result for that particular variable.